Good afternoon. Can everybody hear me? Okay. It is an absolute honor and privilege to be here, and I appreciate the kind introduction. I have been working in the field of grief, loss, and trauma for the last 20 plus years. My passion has always been working with children and families from the time I started my internship at Children's Memorial Hospital in Chicago. Any Illinois families know that it was long enough ago because that's not even the name of the hospital anymore. But then also moving here to Cincinnati to take on the role of social work and care management at Shriners Hospitals for Children. That is where the breadth of my experience working with families whose lives changed very quickly. Whether it was the families of the children who sustained burn injuries, we also worked with a large population of families that had craniofacial anomalies. So those were diagnoses that were either found in utero or after birth, and that recognition of how all of these losses are losses, and they all impact us in different ways. And so I think the most important thing is being able to identify what grief is, and how it's impacting us as individuals. And I think the one way we do that is by learning that language. And that's one of the things we really want to talk about today is to learn about the different types of grief and loss so that we can use that language, discuss the impact of grief and loss on families, on the children, on communities, and provide a space for you guys to be able to share and process the losses that you have experienced. I think the first thing we need to do in every single grief presentation that I do is recognize what we thought grief was is definitely not what the lived experience of grief looks like. I think for starters, the biggest myth is that grief is something we experience when somebody that we love dies. Grief is absolutely something we experience when somebody that we love or care about dies. But we also experience grief at a lot of different intervals and junctions in our lives. And so the acknowledgement of recognizing each person in here has grieved a number of different losses associated with the diagnosis. The other myths that society has taught us that we need to unlearn in order to make room for the reality is that grief and mourning are the same experience. We as a society have started using those words interchangeably. And as a result, when we see people that are no longer externally mourning or externally expressing their grief, we think they're good. The sadness is past, we don't see it, therefore they have made it to the other side of grief. Grief is the experience and the feelings that we carry as a result of a loss. And those are feelings that continue to carry with us. Grief is not something that we get over. It is something that we learn to carry. And so knowing that even if we are not mourning on the outside, we are still absolutely carrying that grief on the inside. Myth number 2, there is a predictable, orderly progression to the grief experience. There is not. We want there to be one. Most people want there to be one. Because we could check off a box and say, okay, I was angry today and I don't have to be angry about this ever again. You could be angry 5 minutes later, it might be 5 days, it could be 5 months, depending on where you are in a grief process. But it is something that is not linear, and it is something that can resurface again over the course of time. When Elizabeth Kubler-Ross wrote her first book, it was called On Death and Dying, and she outlined the 5 stages of grief. We, as a culture and a society, went hog wild because somebody finally gave us the quote-unquote roadmap for grief. 5 things are going to happen to me, I'm going to check them off, and everything is going to be good again. She spent essentially the rest of her life saying, stop, that was not my intention. It wasn't a roadmap, this is not a linear process. Her work wasn't even with individuals who were grieving after a loss. She was working with individuals who were anticipating their own death. And so they are not even identical grief experiences. Not that there are any 2 identical grief experiences. She did 30 years later write a second book called On Grief and Grieving to apply the grieving after a loss process to the 5 stages that the entire world has wanted to use as the roadmap for grief. So all that to say is no matter how much we want there to be a neat and orderly process to the grief experience, that does not exist. The idea that it's best to move away from grief instead of toward it. Now, sometimes it's easier to move away from it, especially sitting in the last panel discussion, acknowledging how much every parent and caregiver is doing. It's hard to let that grief come to the surface and then still be able to continue functioning and doing the things that we have to do, continue showing up for our children, for our families, and to be the caregivers that we are. But I'm going to talk a little bit later on how important it is to create opportunities to be intentional, to give yourself the opportunity to sit with that grief. Tears expressing grief are a sign of weakness. We hear it. Tears are a physiological response to stress and pain. And that is, I tell everybody all the time, I sit in the grief counseling chair, and no matter what, everybody utters one of these statements at some point over the course of grief work. I'm crying too much, or why am I not crying enough? And my response to that question every single time is, what is the right amount? There isn't an answer. There is not a prescriptive amount of time that we are allowed to or not allowed to cry. And tears expressing grief are indeed not a sign of reaction. They are very much a part of the physical experience and the human experience of grief and loss. And as I mentioned in the first one, that concept of grief and mourning not being the same thing, that idea of the goal of getting over grief. I just need to get through this and I will be okay. Grief is something that we are going to continue to carry with us. Because when we talk about grief, especially in relation to diagnoses, watching your kids go through growth and development, you're grieving very different things throughout that course in time. We grieve again very differently after a loss. And so that acknowledgement of this isn't something that we are getting over, but rather this is something that we are absolutely learning how to carry and how to live with. Because grief and loss, or grief and life are not mutually exclusive. It's figuring out how do grieving and living coexist. And I think when we can be very intentional, we can do that in very healthy ways. I changed this slide a little bit from my typical presentation, and I'm going to explain why when we get to the anticipatory grief at the end of the slide. But talking about acute grief, you will notice there are no timelines. I refuse to give timelines. But that's the early stage of grief. And the early stage of grief can look very differently for each person. But that is what we are experiencing right after diagnosis. It is what we're experiencing right after a death, right after a major life change or transition. And that can be an incredibly overwhelmingly emotional experience. Those emotions can be incredibly varied. It can be anger, it can be anxiety, it can be remorse, it can be relief, it can be guilt. But all of those emotions can have that sense of being very overwhelming during that time. And it's when we are very loss-focused. There's the period of adapting to loss, the recognition of, okay, this has happened. How am I going to continue putting one foot in front of the other? How do I continue to recognize that there are things in life that I'm going to be able to do while continuing to carry this grief? Integrated grief, which is when we reach that point of recognizing that we are living and grieving simultaneously. And I think that's when we can say, you know what, I had a grief day, but I found what went well for me. I found something that was good in that day. Or I can say, I had a good day, despite having a few tears this morning. It's the recognition that both can happen in the same space and they don't have to be mutually exclusive. Anticipatory grief. We talk about anticipatory grief most when we are recognizing that somebody has reached a terminal state. And from an anticipatory grief perspective, a recognition of a shortened life expectancy. And when I was doing this slide, usually I'm talking about loss related to death, and anticipatory grief goes first. I think it's so important to acknowledge that for those of you sitting in this space who have been navigating the grief and loss of a life-changing diagnosis, who have been working through this as it relates to your current journey, that this whole process is going to be different again, and grief is going to look and feel differently again after a death loss. And it's not something to scare or cause more upset. It's a recognition that we can be intentional to continue to care for ourselves and know that the tools and the things that we're building are going to be something that we're going to use again in different ways in the future. So who experiences grief? Infants, toddlers, youth, and adolescents. There are lots of people who want to really minimize the grief and loss that infants, toddlers, and young children experience. When I was in the healthcare setting, a lot of people were faced with remarks, people pointing out silver linings. At least your child's young, they don't know any difference yet. Well, we don't know what kids know. Kids do pick up on things. And that recognition of even if something comes about at a young age, kids are going to continue to grieve throughout the course of growth and development. So even if they might not have what is an observable acute grief reaction, so it gets minimized by the outside world, it's not to say that they're not going to be more acute, observable grief reactions as they go through growth and development. Adults are grieving, elderly are grieving, families are grieving, communities are grieving. That recognition of, a family unit is grieving the life they thought the family was going to be. Here within the Low Syndrome Association, you guys are a community, and you guys experience loss as a community. And so being able to acknowledge how that impacts us as individuals, as families, and as communities. I think the one thing that's so important is we talk about all of the things that can bring about grief and loss. Obviously, I said earlier, we know that death is the one thing that society equates to grief, and that's the one thing that society supports grief and loss. Not well, but at least more so in that instance than in others. But the recognition of illness. That diagnosis is a significant loss in many ways, and it's important that we have the language to recognize and acknowledge and seek the support that we need in navigating that time. Injury, addiction, divorce. We talk about grief and loss in regards to adoption or foster care, job loss. And I include all of these examples, even though some might not feel relevant. It's a recognition of when we are navigating ongoing grief and loss, any other losses that we're experiencing are also going to hit us in other ways. So giving yourself permission to recognize that I might have more difficult reactions to other life transitions that are grief and loss related because of the grief I'm already carrying. In talking about grief and loss in the healthcare setting, obviously we talk about the grief and loss that children are going to be experiencing. We talk about the grief and loss that family members, caregivers, parents, loved ones, grandparents, aunts, uncles, there's not a legal definition of who is allowed to grieve and who is not allowed to grieve, but the recognition of anybody that is connected is going to have the potential to grieve, and they may grieve in very different ways. It's really hard when families are grieving one instance within the family, whether it's a diagnosis, if it's a death, if it's a significant life change, but you have 2 adults and 3 other children, and that's 5 people grieving 5 different grief journeys, even though it's all related to one instance. So it's that recognition of how individuals do grieve differently in that case. And healthcare providers and staff. I know you guys talked about how hard it is to find people that are specializing in the presentation that I was in, and access to resources can be so incredibly limited. But the recognition of how frustrating it can be and how hard it can be when providers can't help and can't fix and can't cure. And so that recognition of how do we extend grace to ourselves as we're navigating these journeys, and how do we advocate in ways that also are supportive of providers. So we as a culture have drawn an equals line between grief and sadness. And I think we expect to be sad for a period of time in the midst of any kind of loss. What we don't acknowledge is that grief and loss can bring about every other emotion known to man. And I think once we start to recognize that, okay, you know what? I am in shock, or I'm really, really, really angry. You're allowed to be angry. You're allowed to be upset. You're allowed to be sad. And recognizing that that is all grief, and it's not something that's wrong with you. I think people want so badly to fix grief. We ourselves want things to be back the way they were before, that we're really hard on ourselves for feeling very, very human emotions during a really, really difficult time. I think identifying emotions and being able to connect them to grief does two things. One, it acknowledges the humanness in it. And two, it gives us something to work with. When we can't recognize that, oh my goodness, I am really angry today, I just feel it and I walk around and I can see myself snapping off at every person and every interaction, but I can't do anything with it because I'm not recognizing it for what it is. If I can say, man, I know that I am so angry today. What do I need to do to acknowledge this anger? Do I need to go hit a punching bag? Do I need to go out for a walk? Do I need to go take 5 minutes to take some deep breaths? But when we can identify what we're feeling, we can do something with it versus it controlling us. And I think that there's nothing scarier than feeling as though we are out of control of our bodies or out of control of our emotions when we are navigating very stressful times. So this is not an exhaustive list by any means, but it's just something to help people recognize grief is so much more than sadness. I think some of the things from a low syndrome diagnosis perspective, the loneliness. You guys are here, you guys are together, you are in this space, but we recognize that when you are home and you're in communities, there might not be very many other people, if any other people in the community that understand. So building community and recognizing that that is not an uncommon feeling given the experience, but rather I'm going to recognize that that's what I'm feeling, and I'm going to be intentional to reach out to whoever I was sitting at the table with 4 months ago at the conference so that I don't have to feel this way in the same way right now. Disenfranchised grief. I think that is the one thing that most people are experiencing because it's the grief that we don't talk about. It's the grief that we don't acknowledge. It's the grief that the outside world doesn't acknowledge because you have your child. And so people don't recognize that there is a significant loss associated. And so not having that acknowledged and not being able to seek support for that leads to people carrying that grief alone. And when we don't have outlets and we don't have support, it can complicate the grief process. It's grief that's minimized by others. I will tell you probably the most upsetting phrases that are brought to me by clients that I'm working with, 90% of the time, the sentence started with the word "at least." And anybody that's starting a sentence with the word "at least" is more likely than not going to say something that's minimizing the pain, the upset, the hurt, the disappointment, the frustration, the loneliness, whatever it is that you might be feeling. And I don't think that those statements are ever said with any ill intention, but they come from a desire of trying to make somebody feel better. They're coming from a desire of wanting to fix something that they can't fix. Absolutely. Can we find gratitude in the midst of grief? And we find that in ways of ourselves. And we might say to ourselves, at least I have this, or at least I can do this. That is A-okay if that is coming from within you. It is not okay for us to put that on other people because that doesn't give us the capacity to meet people where they are. Not having our grief supported or having our grief experiences minimized, it does have an impact. It has an impact on our ability to be mentally healthy during the process. It can increase the emotional challenges that we are experiencing. It does result in withdrawal and isolation. Because if we find our people, or at least if we're going to the people that we thought were our people or may have been there for us before, but in this instance they can't be, we're going to distance ourselves the first time they shut us down when we are trying to be honest and authentic and real. Again, not often intentional, but very much impactful on how we experience grief. Physical symptoms. We think of grief as a total mind thing. If we don't have outlets for stress, tension, fear, anger, we're not going to physically be well. And we have to be able to physically be well to take care of our children, our families, and whatnot throughout the process. So knowing that not acknowledging grief does have an impact. Listening to the panel beforehand, I can imagine people sit there and think and say, where do I find time for this? How do I do this? And we're going to talk about that. But again, it's an acknowledgement of, I know there are so many other things that have to rise to the surface, but it's the oxygen mask analogy, which I'm sure you've heard I use day in and day out. We have to put on our own oxygen mask in order to be able to continue to be the best caregivers and the best spouse, partner, family members that we can be. Specific variables related to navigating a low syndrome diagnosis. I am going to say outright, obviously I do not have the direct experience. I do not have training from a low syndrome perspective, but this is very much information that I was able to get in talking with the panelists and doing some research and working with Jerry ahead of time, and we're absolutely going to hear from Patricia and Christina in a little bit. But these are significant variables that we hear about from a grief perspective that I was able to take and kind of help broaden that perspective to see how people might be impacted. Now, we are humans, and humans do one thing innately when they look at a list of things, and we draw comparisons. And more often than not, when we draw comparisons, we end up minimizing our own experiences. And so when I provide a list of variables in any of the grief education programs I'm presenting on, it is not to compare the grief experiences to the people at the table with you. It is to help you think about how these variables might be impacting you, how they're impacting your grief experience, how they're impacting your family, and how you're navigating this time. So this is something that is to kind of really think about how these variables impact individuals, not as a comparison tool. Not that anyone makes comparisons intentionally, but that's just very, very much part of the human process. I think most significant variables are going to be shock and disbelief. And that's a good portion of that acute grief phase. It's figuring out how do I get my handle. It is doing all of the info seeking. It could be totally backing out and trying, like, just I need to shut everybody out. I need to give myself the space. Different people are going to need to different things. There are some people that are going to be scouring all for information, and others, sometimes even within the same family, that are just like covering their ears because they can't take it all in at the same time. Again, it's not a right or wrong, it's just a recognition of how is this shock or disbelief, how is it impacting me? That aspect of denial. You know, you hear something like this, and then you get online or you start talking with other people, and we do start downplaying it. We do start thinking, maybe this isn't right. Maybe they're going to call and tell me they read somebody else's results. That's normal. That's very much something that we would expect. Once there's that recognition of, okay, this is real, this did happen. I don't know what it means yet, but there can be that feeling of like overwhelming sadness, that overwhelming helplessness of, I have no idea how this is going to impact me now. And the picture we used, or that was on the slide earlier that Christina had shared, I told her it's probably going to be one of my favorite grief presentation pictures because the idea of the binoculars. But when we are in that state of sadness and helpfulness, how badly we just want to know what the future is going to be and to know that we're going to be okay. But that recognition of we just need to know, but in that process starting to recognize that our milestones might look different. They will look different. They're going to look different for my child, and they're going to look different from the other children that are sitting around the table or the parents that are sitting around the tables with you. There's anger and there's frustration, and that's okay. Sometimes when you take a step back and you look at that, like, you have a right to be angry if that's what you feel. No one can prescribe the emotions that we're experiencing. The anger and frustration could be at the diagnosis. That anger and frustration can be at the inequities in our healthcare system and all of the red tape that you have to go through to get your child what they need or to get the diagnoses and everything that's going to come down the road. Listening to the gentleman earlier that was talking about the inability to move. Those things are all very, very valid things to be angry about. It also speaks to how these variables are going to impact us very differently over the course of a grief journey. Guilt and blame. I think that it's something that parents are going to put on themselves. Moms are going to put on themselves, potentially, not always. But we question the cause. We question the genetic barriers. We might feel that others are blaming me for doing something wrong. Those are a part of how we work through a process. We ask those questions, and it's recognizing that, okay, I am in this stage right now, but I need to acknowledge it to be able to take the steps to be able to get out of this space so that I can navigate other things. It's not a space we ever want people to be stuck in, but I also want to normalize and validate so people don't feel there's something wrong with feeling those very, very human things. The fear and anxiety, uncertainty about your child's future, quality of life, not knowing how they are going to be accepted, supported, cared for by those outside of your immediate circle. When you guys were talking about school earlier, that idea of safety. How are others going to interact? What is it going to be like? But those fears and anxieties present over the course of time. Working towards a point of acceptance. Okay, this is our life. This is where we are. I'm going to acknowledge that it hasn't been easy to get to this point. I know that there are challenges ahead, but I have momentum. I'm working on building a support system. I'm able to put things in action to help myself to take care of my family. And then that resilience. Focusing on the fact that things can go well even in the midst of loss. You can have one of those really, really, really worst day scenarios that you guys were talking about earlier when filling out paperwork, and how important it is to be honest about how hard those days are. But we can also be intentional to recognize that, oh my God, everything that went wrong could have gone wrong today. But there was that 5 minutes where I got 5 minutes of good snuggles, and I'm going to give myself credit to acknowledge that both can exist. Seeking support, every single person that's here has come to either receive support and or be able to share their support. And then advocacy, the work that you're doing, putting together a library for everybody to access resources. It's finding meaning, and from a grief perspective, we talk about finding meaning. And I think for those who haven't navigated a grief journey, think of meaning as like one day I'm going to wake up and say, oh, this is why this happened. I don't think we ever wake up and say, this is why something like this happened, but rather it's saying, okay, I've lived this, and at least I can help those that are going to follow me. And giving yourself permission to be in those spaces. That's how we show resilience in the midst of a grief journey. Grieving with intention, this is what I'm talking about. When it seems impossible to think that there is anything else that you can fit into your day to take care of yourself, I want you to at least think about, how can I tap into one of these aspects of self? I think we think of grief as something that's got to be a mind over matter scenario, but grief is very much impacting us in so many ways. We have to take care of our physical self as best as possible. And if that means all I can do is do a couple laps in the kitchen, or do a couple walk a couple flights of steps within the house, you know what, at least I know I'm moving my body. It's eating well, it's getting adequate sleep. When you can't get sleep, okay, how am I going to be intentional to take care of myself? I think it's recognizing that these are all the ideals. How do we modify it to fit into our world, to be intentional, to say, I'm doing this to take care of my physical self and prioritizing myself in one aspect of this. Our mental health, our social support systems. Building community is so incredibly key. The next slide is a lot about that. And the one thing I think we can do to help ourselves in that regard is to be able to communicate what our needs are, and to not feel as though it's a burden or it's not okay for me to ask for help when I need it. Emotional safety, emotional health. How am I going to take care of myself? How am I going to identify what are my key triggers? What are the things that are helpful for me to do? What are the things that are not helpful for me to do? But just maintaining an awareness can be key. People always say, like, how do I know if I'm doing something like right or wrong? I'm like, there is no right or wrong way from a grief perspective. More often than not, it's recognizing what feels right to us in any given moment. I do qualify that to say there are definitely healthy and unhealthy ways of grieving. And I think that while there's not a right way in lots of these categories, there are absolutely healthy and unhealthy ways. So to kind of keep that in mind. And then the last one, obviously, being from a spiritual perspective. That doesn't mean necessarily having to go to church. It's however you identify spirituality. It is recognizing it might be time in nature. It might be reading a daily devotional. It might be keeping a gratitude journal. But finding something that gives you the capacity to be in a space where you can be honest and authentic with yourself and what your spiritual needs are. The tips for supporting caregivers and families, it kind of feels a little bit obvious because all of you guys are navigating in this space. But I think oftentimes people want to help. I don't think they often ask how to help in the most helpful of ways. And I think it's giving yourself permission to ask for what you need. If someone says, how can I help you? Especially early on, we might feel so overwhelmed that I don't even know what I need. These are things that could be helpful. You know what? If someone says, how can I help you? It would be really great if you could do some of the legwork to educate yourself on low syndrome. Because it can be emotionally and physically draining for you to be the one expected to educate your family, your friends, and your community about low syndrome. So knowing that it's okay to say this is a great resource, or you can visit the Low Syndrome Association website, or you can visit these spaces so that they can take initiative and learning. Recognize that navigating the life-changing diagnosis is an ongoing process. So letting them know that this is not going to be a, you know what, we're going to reach the 6-month part, we're going to reach the 1-year part, we're going to be good. But helping them to see that this is something that's going to be ongoing. Acknowledging, validating, and normalizing the grief experience. Let's use the language. Let's talk about the hard things that come up as a result of grief. And let your families and friends know that I am grieving right now. And I'm going to be grieving in different ways over the course of time. This is a key one, offering practical and reliable help. Letting people know what they can actually do. They don't know what to do. It might be making a list of things, how people can help you. Do we want help with meals? Do I need help with childcare? Do I need help navigating the legal system for paperwork, and like being able to identify who you can talk to and who you can ask for those things, and then not being afraid to ask for it when you need it. Letting your friends and family know that this isn't something that they can fix. They want to, they can't. I had a client that I worked with that I really liked the language that she used, but she would say, good intention strikes again. And that people would say really well-intentioned things in an effort to help or in an effort to fix, and without realizing that it really does hurt to hear people say some of those things. And I think when she said that, good intention striking again, it gives the implication of, I'm not blaming them, but man, it hurts when I hear those things. Encouraging them to not point out the silver linings. It is hard in those acute stages of grief to know you don't have the energy, you don't even know how you want things to be done. So I don't have an expectation of somebody in acute grief to be a key educator in how to help and how to support friends and family when they're navigating a grief and loss situation like this. But as you get a little further down the road and you're continuing to carry the grief in the ways that you are, there might be opportunities to say, you might not remember this, but you said this early on and it really was not helpful. And I'm not saying because I want to blame you, I just don't want you to say this or cause the same upset for somebody else down the road. And I think giving the ability to help educate has a ripple effect of other families are going to walk through, whether it is a LS diagnosis or whether it is any other number of diagnoses that people might be navigating. The more we can educate on what is helpful and what is not helpful, I think it's important to think about. And letting people know that checking in, like, you know what, right now we're good. Check in a month or two. Check in 2 hours, depending on where you're at. That recognition of, I'm going to need this help ongoing. And what I need is going to look different. but I appreciate any and all of the support that you can offer. And it is hard to be the one to ask for what we need, but more often than not, if we don't ask for it, people in our everyday lives aren't going to come forward with these things in the same way. And it's not because people don't want to, it's that we are very avoidant and because people don't know what to do. And unfortunately, sometimes people think the same opposite of the at least is we have the people that just don't say anything, and that can be equally hurtful for people who are navigating grief and loss. I did want to touch on kids briefly, not only for the children themselves with the diagnosis, but if there are also siblings or cousins or kids in school, peers that they have. When we are supporting kids, the American Academy of Pediatrics has the CARES approach, which I think is incredible, to help support kids in resilience. Creating a safe space for a child to talk freely and not shutting them down. Anyone that has worked with kids, raised kids, knows that kids have lots of questions and observations, generally not at the most opportune and convenient times, but how important it is to meet kids where they are when they come to you with those questions. Rest assured, if you are in a space where you're not having the conversation they're wanting you to have, say, I hear you, and revisit it as soon as you are in a space where you can have that conversation. Because kids are going to pick up on patterns, and if it's something that we're not comfortable talking with, or if they get shut down on a conversation more than once or twice, they're going to stop trying to have those conversations. Acknowledging and validating a child's concerns. If they are valid. Kids also have magical thinking. So if they're coming to you with something that feels like, whoa, that's way out of left field, that's nowhere close to where we are, instead of saying, we don't have to worry about that, say, I hear that as a concern of yours. Let's talk about where we are right now. To just make sure that we take them out of the space where they are, but we want to acknowledge it and then give them the information to meet them where they are. Reassuring a child that they are not alone. Kids are going to pick up on the differences within themselves, differences within their siblings, in different ways over the course of time. The awarenesses of differences are very much going to be on the surface in the beginning, and then that's going to continue to change and evolve. But I think that recognition of being able to reassure a child at all of those stages that they are not alone. Encouraging appropriate play, skill building, helping them continue to be a child, and giving them appropriate play, skill building to work through what they are working through as well. And sharing honest and age-appropriate information with a child. Our gut inclination is always going to be to protect, but if we protect, their minds might take over, and so by not giving them information, we know that kids might come up with information that could be worse than the reality, and so then that elevates their stress and anxiety. So as much as we can give them honest and age-appropriate information, that's going to be incredibly helpful for them. Feelings and communication, recognizing that just like we talked about all of the ways in which we as adults can grieve, children are going to do it in just as many emotions in very different ways. And so we really want to honor that and give them that space, help them to have language, help them to be able to recognize their thoughts and their feelings. It comes from us modeling it. Modeling the healthy expression of emotions does not mean you never let a child see you cry. Because I think so often we want to protect children from our emotions. So therefore, if mom's not crying, I shouldn't be either. Or dad doesn't cry, I need to keep that to myself. There's a fairly well-known story that people tell a lot in the grief world of a parent that was very proud of himself because he never let his children see him cry. But then you talk to the children and they would say, well, dad cries every day in the shower. Like, the kids knew what was going on. They also knew that it wasn't something that was going to be supported or shared. It was something that I had to do on my own. So recognizing how we are modeling to say, you know what? I'm having a hard day. I'm having a grief day. Give them language and let them see that. That also goes to say, if you're having a really, really difficult day and you know that the emotions are overwhelming you, it's also okay to take a break so that you can be authentic and get the outlet that you need, while also still recognizing that you don't want to cause additional upset by your child seeing an overwhelming amount of emotion. There is no perfect, it is a balancing act, but it's just having the awareness of how both experiences can impact kids in different ways. Normalize the emotions, the experience. They can be sad, they can be scared, they can be frustrated. They're also allowed to be kids, they're allowed to have fun, they're allowed to yell, they're allowed to play, they're allowed to be excited. Grief does not exist in a vacuum. Like I said earlier, it's how do grieving and living coexist. And you know what? If your kid's having a happy day and you're having a grief day, both are okay. And it's giving yourself that permission. It's okay for them to feel however they are feeling. And then when you're talking with kids, acknowledging and accepting that we might not be able to answer the questions or solve the problems that they have, but it's acknowledging that they've been heard, acknowledging that it's something that we can look into. I can ask some more questions, let me get back to you. Or if you have the information and you need a minute to figure out how you want to deliver it in an age-appropriate way, it's okay to repeat back the question to the children. Let them know that you've heard the question and say, that's a really good question. Let me get some information and we'll talk about this later today, kind of a thing. So recognizing if it's going to bring something up in you, you can acknowledge questions and revisit them, and that's an okay way to do it. When you are caring for a grieving child, and when you're caring for yourself or family members who are all grieving, there is no time limit. We're not getting over this. We are learning how to live with it. We are learning how to carry it. Children are going to grieve more sporadically. They can hear information and be like, okay, out the door. And 2 hours later, they come back and be like, what was it that you said earlier? And it's going to be a processing of it over the course of time. This is interesting, and I give a disclaimer every time I do this, is children are going to reprocess experiences and grief over the course of development. And we talk so much about that in grief. We talk about that so much in child development. We as adults continue to grieve over our stages of development as well. Like, development doesn't stop at the age of 18. They're saying adolescence now is 26. But that recognition of we extend a lot of grace to children grieving over the course of development. And I really hope that we start to extend some of that same grace towards ourselves as we navigate through continued development into adulthood. Birthdays, holidays, milestones, those may feel different in the midst of a diagnosis. They may feel different in the midst of a decline. And they are probably going to feel very different after the loss of a child and after the loss of anybody. That recognition of our grief can be intensified over the course of time, and that is totally normal. I'm very intentional when I'm talking about grief is I do not use the time heals all wounds, and I don't ever say that grief gets better with time, because healing and better give the illusion of no hard days. And when we are living life and carrying grief, there's always a capacity that we may encounter a hard day. And I think that when we know that, we can extend a little bit more grace and kindness towards ourselves. I know that that is a lot of information, and that is from a grief education perspective. I think it's really helpful to think about the reality of grief and not the social construct of grief that we often envision prior to individuals living their own grief experiences. But I'm really excited that both Christina and Patricia are willing to share their grief experiences from the low syndrome parent perspective, because I think it's a good way to put, what we have heard and what we know can be true about grief into the lived experiences of people who are walking in those shoes. So I'm very, very thankful both of them have agreed to be here, and I'm going to let them introduce themselves and share some of their grief experiences, and then we'll take questions from you guys.
Okay, I'm going first. I'm Christina. Hello, everybody. I'm really regretting volunteering right now, but it's going to be great. My name's Christina. My husband is John, and our son is Robert. He was in the pictures up there. He's 8.5. My husband and I are both archaeologists, and so there's a lot of talk about that stuff in our house, or there used to be. It's Robert's least favorite subject, and he interrupts us anytime we talk about it. He loves cars, wheels, of course, garage doors, twigs, and rocks right now. My questions that Donna sent to me, to us earlier in preparation for this panel was about new diagnosis. And I thought that I would be able to talk about that because it felt so far away from, come a long way over the 8 years. Robert was diagnosed when he was 8 months old. And it felt like a very long time to get to that point. We had a lot of feeding issues at first, and we didn't get any answers until we had some wonky urine tests. And we were sent up to Portland at OHSU, the teaching hospital there, to look at some other genetic things. So we're sent to genetics like twice for 2 different rounds of testing. And the first round we were looking at the option or the things that they were suggesting with the hypotonia, cataracts, and then some wonky urine stuff. And there was a couple that were presented to us, and we said, no, that doesn't sound quite right. And then we got in touch with a nephrologist. They thought maybe he had a kidney stone. They were very confused down in Eugene, Oregon, where we were living at the time. And the nephrologist came in, and he said, I think I might know what this is, and I've seen it once in my career. And there's one kid in the state, and he handed me a piece of paper about it, and he said, this is a devastating diagnosis, and it ranges from nearly normal to severely impaired, which is like, great. Great, tell brand new parent of the entire range of the human experience. But reading that piece of paper, we knew that that's what it was immediately. And it was a very difficult time, but it also, I think, led to some relief that we finally knew what we were dealing with. And it helped with, getting the doctors off our back for his weight, size, and not gaining enough weight. And this group has been amazing to be a part of. Donna asked in looking back, what would you say to yourself during that time? And I would say that I wish I had found a therapist sooner. That has been really life-changing, and I wish I had done it sooner. I tried working through it all on my own and with my husband, of course, and I ended up, my body broke down where I couldn't ignore it anymore. I wish I would have gotten on antidepressants sooner, so that's also very helpful. And being engaged with this group, especially on the Facebook group, is amazing, and you find a lot of answers very quickly. But it's also important to take breaks, and I really needed that early on. I saw, you see people in their worst days trying to get help in sometimes emergency situations, and it's a great resource, but allow yourself a break, focus on your kid, and I think, not that everybody should necessarily drink alcohol, but you do what you want. One of the things that my husband and I started was we drank a glass of champagne every day, and we talked about what we can celebrate every day, every milestone, he laughed today, literally anything and everything. And it brought us closer together and through this journey so far. So I think I'll pass it on to you.
Thank you. And Donna covered a lot of good things and things I'm probably going to mention again, so sorry if it's repetitive. And I was going to say, grief is like a really sneaky thing. Because I'm like about to tear up right now. Yeah. And it's weird because I'm a registered nurse, so of course I've seen death, you know, I've experienced it, but you do kind of dissociate from it. You get used to it, you help the family, and you kind of move on to the next patient. Anyway, let me start with my intro. I just had to say that real quick. I'm Trisha Bass, and my low boy is Aiden. He's 13, and my husband and my other son, Isaiah, is also here. And I have 2 stepchildren, but they're older, not here. We're from North Carolina. I just want to start by saying, too, that obviously it's a very personal experience, and anything that I say is my own thing, and it's not, you know, I'm not telling you what you should do or not do or whatever. I feel like anticipatory grief is like something I never really heard of before, but it's so like constant. It's an ebb and flow, right? It sneaks up on you. It's up and down, in and out, and it can really be dark and really gloomy, like crippling. And I've experienced a lot of grief outside of this, and I'll talk about that in a minute, but I really do think about morbid death a lot more than I used to, like probably more than most people. And my husband is kind of the opposite. He doesn't want to talk about it. So then I kind of feel like I'm being too negative. I'm always just like, when do you think you're going to die? I mean, I'm always just like, you know, what if you die tomorrow? I'm just so, you know, anyway. There's like the feeling the ball is going to drop at any minute, like what's going to happen? So when I first got the diagnosis, and I won't go too much in that story, but I was really devastated because it took 6 years, and I was on the way back we were doing a research study, and he'd already been genetically tested, and they didn't find anything. So we just happened to get in this research project because he has hearing aids, and so that's how they found us. And then when they told me, it's like, right, they give you the piece of paper, have a good day, see you later, you know, and I'm just reading it, and I'm just on the way home like, what in the world? And my nurse brain is like, and I went right to that CKD, and that just devastated me. As a nurse, I realized that's like the death sentence. That, to me, as a nurse, that's how I saw that. And that's what killed me. So I knew what that meant, and whew, anyway. I was really angry. I mean, and I'm a very spiritual person, like I love the Lord. But for about 3 years, I was very angry at God. Just asking why. Sorry. Over time, I came to accept it, of course, and I slowly shifted my thinking of just dealing with it. I wouldn't say accepting it, just dealing with it. I grieve and I become bitter sometimes when I watch other typical kids, right, like my nephews, and they just get to experience anything and everything, just with so much ease and just no restrictions, and just I can go to whatever camp I want. I can do whatever school I just do whatever I want, and I get really jealous and envious about that. And I grieve that the world is just not built for our kids. And I grieve about how the future is going to be. And like, I'm so tired of advocating, like fighting for the camps, and I'm just exhausted. But anyway, I often think about how Aiden's going to pass away, and like what will that look like? What day? It's kind of a dread of thinking about it, and it really does consume me sometimes. And I'll have to share a story. And I was thinking about what Dr. Brewer said earlier about the kidney disease. I had a friend of mine about a year ago who had lupus and chronic kidney disease, and she ended up getting on dialysis, but she was on it for 15 years, and she had no family, no support, and she was at the point where she was going like 5 days a week, and no quality of life. And watching her over the years go in and out of the hospital alone, no support, was just heartbreaking. And when she finally got a doctor to listen to her and say, I just don't have no quality of life, I don't want to do this anymore, they agreed to, you know, take her off dialysis, and that was honestly the best 2 weeks of her life at the hospice house. She was just living it up. But as a friend and a nurse, I had a realization, like, is this how my kid's going to pass away? Am I going to watch him slowly, like, die from the kidney disease? And I just like, wow, maybe that's what was preparing me. I don't know. But it was a weird experience, and I really did think about my son a lot watching that happen. And so I think about a lot, like his future, like what decision am I going to make? Like Dr. Brewer said, am I just not going to do the dialysis? I'm not going to do the transplant. I'm just going to let him pass. I mean, it's just a weird thing to think about, you know? And so, like I said, I've experienced a lot of grief. I've had a lot of very traumatic, violent deaths, like around me. A couple years ago, my son's girlfriend got stabbed to death. And then 3 weeks after that, my stepdaughter's 4-year-old son actually shot himself in the head and died. And that was very difficult. But when it's happening like around you, it's different than happening to you, right? Like as a nurse, I can give someone good advice, or I can be positive Polly, but I don't do that for myself, and I don't know why. I can't like translate that sometimes. Also, like, I don't know about everybody else, but I've grieved the career I thought I was going to have. I would not be working the job I have right now if I had more, the freedom to do it, and so I just kind of, my friends say, well, you need to quit this job. I'm like, no, because I'm terrified I'm not going to get a job that understands my situation. And even though I know I'm capable of more, I know I can move up in whatever ladder, but it's made me realize that he's my, life now. And that's okay. That's a sacrifice. But it's a grieving process to realize that I'm not going to live that career that I thought I was going to have, and thinking about, like, in the future, like, how he's going to change. And that's really made me think about how I experience him now. Like, I try to give him all the experiences he can. Like hiking. He loves hiking. What if he can't hike in 10 years and he's, physically more disabled? So I'm just constantly pressuring myself, to be honest. Like, I got to do this every weekend. I got to go take him to do something. I got to get him out there. And it's a lot of pressure on me, and my husband. But it's more me. Don't tell him he's not in the room. Okay. And I know some people probably resonate with this, but like family. Have you grieved over people you thought were going to show up for you, like friends and family, that now just like ghosted you and don't show up, don't call, don't care, don't help you? And that really is one of my big things that really has bothered me so much. And if I do try to talk to my mom about it, like my siblings, she's like, well, they're just busy. I'm like, no, that's an excuse. And I think about what I would do, and I'm like, no, that's not right. So I do have a little anger about that, but, it is what it is. Sorry, if I'm taking too long, y'all let me know. Again, I do put a lot of pressure on myself. Like, even if I eat something bad for me, I start thinking about it. Like, I shouldn't be eating this because I'm going to end up with diabetes, and I'm not going to be able to take care of Aiden, or I need to lose this weight. I got to walk today. I got to do all these things to try to stay healthy, right? Or I put a lot of pressure on him. No, you need to eat these vegetables so your kidneys will be okay. I'm just, where my husband's like, just let him eat what he wants. I'm like, no, he needs to be healthy. It's very consuming, okay? So it's a lot of guilt there too. Also, like, none of us want to be planning our son's funeral, right? But that's the reality that some of us will face and have faced already. So when I get too overwhelmed, I do really just try to focus on today. And that's what I've learned through this whole thing, right? Because at the beginning, you're like, oh my God, what's going to happen? You have no idea. And you kind of go down a really deep rabbit hole, But everything has been okay. I mean, I still get angry. I still have my days, and I walk around the house a lot saying, this is just too much. This is just too much. I can't do this. But I have done it, I'm not perfectly. So again, I just try to stay in the moment as much as possible and focus on watching him live his life, because he's not burdened by this. I am. He's just like, happy day. Life is great. I'm doing what I want to do. He's not worried about the pressures of the world, like what job I'm going to have, how much money I'm going to make, and they don't care. They're just so happy and joyful. And that is what we've learned, is like living through him, like participating in that, like, wow, what a freedom they have to be so free. And that's what I try to focus on, is being in that moment with him. And just being the joy, right? So that's that. Okay. Also, we all know, our kids are a gift to us, I do think that, I hate the cliche of this happened for a reason. I do hate that, but it's made me and my husband and my other children better people. We look at the world differently. Me and Julie had this conversation last night. We look at the world differently. We see the world differently. We look at people differently. We may have more compassion, empathy, and that's what I take away from it. So maybe what did happen to me for a reason. Maybe it happened for me to change. I don't know, but that's just how I think about it. But I do pray. I do believe in God. And I do rely on him to give me the strength and to wisdom to get through it, just to understand it. And so thinking about what I would tell myself back when I got the diagnosis is, it's going to be okay, even if it's really not, right? It's not. But it is. It's going to be okay. You're going to be okay. Even if you have hard days, it sucks, you're going to make it. You're going to be okay. And so that's kind of how I get it. And I wanted to also say that everybody in this room is doing an amazing job. You're all amazing people for your kiddos and your family, and I just wanted to say that. So I hope this helps somebody in this room.
I just had a quick follow-up on what you said that I really appreciated, and I meant to say and forgot to do it. The grieving of a career that I thought I was going to have. And I have a PhD. I spent a long time getting it. And what I will say is that I've really focused on intentionally slowing our lives down to meet Robert where he's at. And I've had to quit a job that I really was interested in having. And it was a hard transition. I work on it every day. But the opportunities, the work opportunities that have come up because of my intentionally slowing down and being really careful of how I spend my time and working time in for myself and the things that I need to do, like gardening and crocheting and those things, has been really helpful.
Yeah.
So that's all.
I can't thank you guys both. Oh, stay up here. I'm not letting him off the stage that easily. Thanking you guys both for being here. When we are talking about unlearning what we thought grief was and giving ourselves the language to recognize the reality of all the ways in which grief does show up in the midst of this journey, it is grieving all aspects of what we thought our lives were going to be, what we thought our child's life was going to be, and what we thought our family's lives were going to be. And the acknowledgement of it does change your role of what you thought being a mom was going to be, what you thought dad was going to be. But to just hear from your perspective how you have been able to acknowledge the significant challenges that came about and give yourself permission to grieve in those spaces, but also the intention to look at what came from the experiences.
Can I say one thing? That's what I wanted to speak on too, was look at how much our boys do accomplish. Like, you don't think they're going to walk. You don't think they're going to do things. And they do, and they surprise us. So I encourage you to focus on that and see, they can do things, and sometimes they can't, and that's okay. It may change. But just highlighting that and speaking to that.
1,000%. We see what we're looking for. When we are in a loss-centric space, when we are in a grief-centric space, all we see is what we've lost. All we see is what won't be. And if we can be intentional, to grieve with intention, to acknowledge that, yes, there are losses, there are still opportunities. I agree. I 1,000% hate the phrase, everything happens for a reason, if somebody is telling somebody that. However, when an individual comes to that on their own and can say, I don't have to like this, but there's something within me that I can acknowledge, we can say those things for ourselves.
And I think about how much my son has impacted the people around him, just at school and camp, the grocery store. People go, oh, where's Aiden? I love to see Aiden. And they've changed their thinking because of it. So that speaks to that just like him being that gift and showing other people how to change their thinking. So.
And we can appreciate and find grace in those moments, and we can still be angry on the same day, right? That's the idea of recognizing that this is not an all or nothing. It's a recognition of how do we carry this with us? How do we acknowledge the experience? How do we look for those moments? And how do we continue putting one foot in front of the other to create something that is what is, while still acknowledging it's not what we expected it to be. I know we had planned on taking some questions. I don't know. I'm
Anybody want
defer
to
to Jerry
speak
on
or
time.
offer their insights or experiences?
We do. Do you guys? Is there any questions? Yeah. There's one far back corner for you.
Thank you, all three of you, so much. To any of you or Donna, I was just wondering, I loved the words you used around grief and everything, and the slides for tips for supporting a caregiver. And then, just as a human being, I often don't know what I need or how to communicate my needs. And so just in listening to you, and then I asked my sister, because I wasn't sure how we were split as humans, if most people do know, I need a meal or I need a ride, so is, or how grieving affects that, I guess, or if you have any thoughts. Thank you on that.
On like what to ask for?
No, if most people do know what they need, like no, mostly I can say my next best step, but I feel like I'm guessing, and I just don't know if most people actually do know.
In the midst of the grief, we don't know what we need. And that's why I say, like, in the tips, like, advice-wise, people are always asking me, what should I offer? And I will say, think about things that you can offer and give people opportunities, but know that you are not alone, especially early on. I don't know what in the world I need, but if a support person says, hey, I'm going to drop off food for you. Do you want it on Tuesday or Thursday? I can decide if I want a meal on Tuesday or Thursday. There's a couple different, there was a grief video that I use a lot in my grief work presentations where somebody said that they're like, we got a laundry service for you. All you got to do is put all your clothes out on the doorstep on Tuesdays. They'll pick it up. You'll get it back on Wednesday. I don't know that I would put all my dirty laundry out there, but for some people it could be an absolutely welcomed relief. I think sometimes we know what we need, we don't know how to ask for it. I think sometimes we just don't know what we need, and that need is going to change and vary. So don't beat yourself up if you don't know what you need, but don't be afraid to say yes if people offer something that you feel a sigh of relief, like, oh my God, if you can deliver food, that would be amazing. But yeah, I don't want you to feel as though, I think in the midst of shock, in the midst of grief and loss, in the midst of trauma, everything feels so uncertain that even the things that are so second nature for us to know that we need don't feel like second nature because everything we thought we knew is being questioned. Does that make sense?
My friend always says, do you need a solution or you just need me to listen? She always starts that when I'm like, got a problem. So I go, okay, yeah, that's good because they'll offer solutions like, I didn't need you to do that. I just wanted you to listen, you know, so.
Oh, another one behind you, I think.
Where? Oh.
I just wanted to make sure that people know, if you haven't joined our LSA community on Facebook yet, the LSA community is a place where you'll know when we have our caregiver support Zooms, which Corey, who's been online earlier today with us, and I co-facilitate, and that's a place to be, as I heard in the women's circle last night, you know, with people who really get it, because we all hopefully have loving people in our local community and family around us, but we just explore things like grief and like potty training and like all kinds of different things. So please join the LSA community on Facebook if you haven't yet, so you'll know when we offer those, though we also let you know by email.
And that's a great way to find out other things that can be helpful by asking what other families, what was helpful to them early on, gives you the capacity to help formulate what would be helpful for you.
And I do that group too. She facilitates, but I go every time and I love it. It's great. Anyway.
This was a really, really great session. Thank you for your courage to share and be vulnerable. And we've obviously recorded this, so thank you guys so much. It was awesome. Donna, thank you so much.